Hello my friends, this is Dr. M. To support your journey with intermediate microeconomics, we continue our discussion of homothetic preferences. And the last video was ending with who is paying for the marriage, how much does it cost, and whether the length of the dating has any relationship to successful marriage. So first of all, in order to answer those questions, let me go back to our graphical presentation that will be illustrative as we answer those questions. We have already implicitly answered the questions who is paying for the marriage. The marriage is paid by someone who is willing and able and actually does give up utility in order to stay married. So you can see from this graph that both of them could equally give up the utility and thus meet in the middle. And once you connect all those points with the orange dotted line, this is the compromise that stems from the fact that both of them give up the utility to stay together. Now, let's answer other question in terms of how long is optimal in economic terms dating should be. You have encountered, I'm sure, that there are increasing number of cohabiting couples. Basically, when man and woman, they live together without officially being married. Well, it has some issues, and the issue comes or starts with the fact that after cohabiting together, even in the name of getting to know each other, however you want to justify it, once they do this for a while, marriage typically does not last. Once they decide to formally marry after living together, it does not last. And let me explain to you why. And I'm going to the notepad. It will help you to think through some economic trade-offs. So we are looking at preferences, again, between man and woman. And I'm just going to say woman here and man here. Here's your budget constraint. We know that she's happy here to watch soap opera and he is happy here to watch football game. So let's say that he decides to meet her here, and she doesn't have to give up anything, but he, moving from A to B, actually pays for this marriage, or cohabiting together. Cohabitation, my friends, is raising the following issue. You see, this marriage price that is indicating from A to B, when people are having a very loose relationship that lacks commitment, and clearly when couple want to live together on those loose terms, it brings an interesting property. When things go wrong, or when they don't agree on certain issues, they have a chance to split. And that splitting is fairly inexpensive. They can do it at any time. That is not true if they were formally married, because divorce is very expensive. And in fact, it could be so expensive that for many families, it just destroys both people financially, emotionally, and such. Because this splitting apart is considerably more expensive than in the case when people just living together. You will have to hypothesize the fact that, whenever price is going up for their union together, and he doesn't want to pay for this marriage, he just moves out, and they may come back and live together again, and so forth and so on. So essentially, they get used to the idea that this marriage has this very very unstable and flexible condition. So flexibility lies within the fact that she or he can split this union at any moment, and it costs them almost nothing. Now, with marriage, it's not the case. Once you engage in such flexibility and do it for a long time, it is hard to give it up. So when people have this flexibility property attached to their relationships for a long time, and then they engage into marital commitment that is more expensive, that's what makes marital commitment so unstable, because people have to adjust their preferences, and thus this marriage, after living together for a long time without being married, is likely not to last, and very detrimental. All right, so that's what is related to the fact how long and whether the dating is going to impact this probability of successful marriage. What I would like to do next, I would like to look at integration of faith and learning, and here's your summary in front of you. And where do we start with integration of faith and learning? And look how many references I have for you, my friends, so you can truly see the application of homothetic preferences when it comes to integration of faith and learning. So essentially, this is what I'm going to do. Before we go through those lines, I would like you to consider the following graphical presentation. Conceptually, it's going to be identical to what we have seen before, and with one exception, that I'm going to look at presentation of any person, whether it's male or female, and right here we'll say Jesus. Clearly, Jesus communicated his preferences through the New Testament, and Bible calls our relationship to Jesus as marriage, in fact. And it even has the reference that the church is the bride and Jesus is the groom, and at some point this marriage will take place biblically and spiritually, and thus each of us has to answer this question: how far we are from Jesus, or how far our preferences apart from Jesus. My friends, just to be completely blunt and honest, we know that we are far away from Jesus when it comes to preferences, and that's what is constituting this distance between our preferences. That begs an interesting question that haunted the church for 2,000 years. And that's the question is, when you are increasing poverty, does it have to do anything with spirituality? In other words, once your budget constraint shifts towards origin and you become more poor, does it mean that it gives you the chance to be closer to Jesus? Based on the graph, yes, it does. And let me say to you this. For a wealthy individual, it's always more expensive to die than for poor counterpart. And if you think about the parable that Jesus shared with us related to Lazarus and the wealthy man, first and foremost, we have to recognize if we look around, we know wealthy people by name. Bill Gates, Michael Dell, and many others, Warren Buffett, many others that are worldly recognized as wealthy individuals. But if you go to the parable that Jesus offered in relationship to a wealthy individual that died and basically had to face the consequences for his life after death, and Lazarus, the poor counterpart that had to go to heaven. And notice that Jesus mentions, Bible is mentioning Lazarus by name, but the wealthy individual is not even mentioned by name. Just the very opposite from what we live in reality when it comes to our everyday decisions. All right, so let's go back to our presentation and go line by line, emphasizing homothetic preferences and its application. So, number one, do not be yoked together with unbelievers, for what does righteousness and wickedness have in common? 2 Corinthians 6:14. You see, if you decide to pursue this theory of homothetic preferences and you do marry against Apostle Paul's advice not to, at the time when you have such a different preferences in terms of you are pursuing righteous values and your partner into the consideration, under the consideration for to be your a part of your future family, has a wicked preferences, you will have a hard time to save this marriage, because the distance between your preferences based on the graph and the preferences of that person is going to be very substantial. Think about someone who is going to marry from very different cultures. And I have known such marriages through my encounters when I traveled around the world. And they have, some of them survived, but boy, it's very expensive marriage, because you have to compromise as an intrinsic part of any marriage, and it takes much more to compromise when you share very different background. For example, you are Christian and he is Muslim, or she's Muslim and you are Christian. So different religious beliefs make your distance between your preferences are much wider, and thus making marriage more expensive, setting you up for high probability of divorce, because you want to go back and ask this question: what does the righteousness and wickedness have in common? That's exactly what Apostle Paul was trying to address when it comes to our homothetic theory application. And essentially, that's what psychologists do when it comes to marital counseling. They're trying to figure out what it takes for two people to overcome those differences that is measured by the distance in the preferences. And clearly, for a wealthy people, to be married is more expensive. That's why you encounter such stories where some wealthy individuals from Hollywood, they stayed married only for a few days. They couldn't possibly overcome such a huge distance that was comprised by their wealth and the difference in preferences. And while some find that very amusing, I see that as a very sad truancy. On the other hand, when you have only 2 potatoes to share for dinner, you do not argue which restaurant you want to go to. So let's go to the second one, and that's going to be, but those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this. So it's just basically an introduction to the idea that marriage is expensive. And it does require compromise, it does require giving up utility. The first and foremost, you want to understand who you are. Just like Aristotle made that very issue as the paramount objective for any living person. You want to understand who you are. And that means you want to see your own capability, how much you are willing to give up for your loved one or your future family member. And clearly Jesus indicated that there is no greater love than when you are ready to give up your own life. Are you? And when it comes to that, would you really be willing to do this? So I want you to overcome this idea that De Beers, the manufacturer of the diamonds, is preaching so skillfully to you, and saying that the price of the marriage is a diamond or the size of the diamond. No, it's not. It's every single day when you have to reject yourself and your own preferences for the name of another person. That's what marriage is. Finally, I want you to understand, when man and woman decide to cohabit or live together without being married, you have to clearly see that the price distribution of such marriage is not homogeneous. In fact, we already know that aging is taxing women considerably more, whether it's related to the biological age in terms of this window of opportunity to have children, or some other ways, but she is paying for such so-called unmarried, formally unmarried union, much higher prices. Now the courts and society is recognizing that, and they try to mitigate that problem by issuing spousal maintenance, child support, but it's never really reaching equality, because those things is hard to measure. I mean, how do you value those years of being attractive that are gone, and they're no longer on your side? It's a difficult matter, and it is an economic problem. So now, the next thing that we want to look at, when Jesus stated, it's easier for a camel to go through an eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. And the eye of a needle and this parable was illustrating a small gate in Jerusalem where it was very difficult to enter, very narrow. And basically, Jesus is reiterating that if you're going to be a wealthy individual, then for you to stay married to Jesus, it's just going to be expensive. He's not saying it's impossible, but he is showing us the degree of difficulty the wealthy people have to overcome. And that brings us to an interesting consideration that every one of us is facing. How much wealth each one of us can handle? That's a good question in order to stay married to Jesus. Because there is a limit for every one of us. For someone, it could be $1 million, beyond which we no longer can handle marriage to Jesus. And that means sacrificing and compromising for the sake of Jesus every single day. For others, it could be $20,000. And it's important that you are going to learn about yourself, who you are. And that's why it is so critical in the life journey to understand those issues. And finally, we are going to move to the King Solomon, who was proclaimed by the scripture as the wisest and the wealthiest person that ever lived. And look at his prayer. Do not give me, Lord, too much wealth, so I would not forget you. I apologize for paraphrasing this, but it was very prophetic. Solomon was not just a king, he was a prophet. He prophesied what will happen to him in regards to his own choices. So he begged God not to give him so much wealth because he knew that at some point it will corrupt him to the point where he will no longer afford. Imagine that. The wealthiest man can no longer afford marriage to God. So that's the paradox, so to speak. The wealthier you become, the more unaffordable it becomes for you to be married to Jesus. So I want to move on with lottery, because at some point I did promise to you that I'm going to address the lottery winning, and I think it's a good time. So let me ask this question, and I will stop this video for now and come back to complete it. When it comes to gambling, what is gambling? I want you to think about this. What is gambling, and is it playing the lottery? Is it investing in a stock market? Is it buying the house? Is it making proposal to get married? Where the gambling starts and where the gambling stops? This is the question I want you to think about, and we'll come back to answer those questions with the next video. Thank you guys for your time.